The Hitchhiker in the Rain. It was a bleak, rainy evening in the heart of Pennsylvania, and Melissa, a waitress at a small diner in Hershey, was driving home after her late-night shift. The storm had turned the usual picturesque backroads into a dark, desolate labyrinth, with raindrops hammering against her windshield like tiny fists. Her sedan's headlights pierced through the gloom, illuminating patches of wet asphalt and the occasional skeletal branches of roadside trees. The road stretched endlessly before her, flanked by an intimidating forest that seemed to press in from all sides. As her tires splashed through a shallow puddle, Melissa caught sight of something out of place. Beneath the dim glow of a flickering streetlight in an otherwise deserted parking lot, a figure stood hunched in the rain. Melissa squinted, her grip on the steering wheel tightening. It was a woman, tall and frail, with an arm outstretched, frantically waving for help. Against her better judgment, Melissa slowed the car to a stop and rolled her window down just enough to call out. "Do you need a ride?" she asked, her voice slightly strained to be heard over the pounding rain. The woman approached quickly, her soaked clothes clinging to her gaunt frame. Her face, pale and gaunt, revealed a broad smile that sent a faint shiver down Melissa's spine. Up close, the stranger looked older than Melissa initially thought, maybe in her late 50s. "You're an angel," the woman exclaimed, water dripping from her tangled hair. "Just to the next town, if it's not too much trouble." Melissa hesitated but then nodded, unlocking the passenger door. The woman climbed in with an awkward eagerness, murmuring repeated thanks. The interior of the car filled with the damp, earthy smell of rain-soaked fabric. As Melissa pulled back onto the road, she glanced sideways at her passenger. Her clothes were shabby but not filthy, though something about her appearance was unsettling. Strands of her wet hair stuck to her hollow cheeks, and when she smiled, Melissa noticed gaps where teeth should have been. They drove in silence for a few minutes, the rhythmic swish of the windshield wipers the only sound between them. Finally, Melissa broke the awkward quiet. "What were you doing out there?" she asked, her tone light but edged with curiosity. "Just waiting," the woman replied, her voice oddly soft. She turned her head to look at Melissa, her smile unwavering. "It's hard to find a kind soul these days." Melissa nodded, unsure how to respond. As they approached a small gas station near an intersection, Melissa decided to pull over. "I'm going to grab something to drink," she said. "Do you want anything?" The woman shook her head, her smile remaining fixed. "No, thank you, sweetheart. You've done enough." Melissa stepped out into the rain, grateful for the brief reprieve from the stranger's unnerving presence. She hurried into the gas station, paid for a few items, and returned to her car. But when she opened the door, her passenger was gone. Her heart skipped. The parking lot was empty, save for her vehicle and the soft hum of the streetlight. The woman had disappeared into the storm without a trace. Melissa's eyes darted around the empty parking lot as unease coiled tightly in her chest. The gas station was small, with no obvious place for someone to hide. The pounding rain seemed to drown out all other sounds, leaving her alone with the faint hum of the flickering streetlight above. She scanned the nearby trees and surrounding darkness, but the woman was nowhere to be seen. Where could she have gone so fast? Melissa muttered to herself, sliding back into the driver's seat. Her hands trembled as she started the engine, the sound of the rain almost deafening now. A part of her felt relieved. The woman's strange smile and gaunt face had unsettled her from the moment she'd pulled over. But another part, the one that had stopped to help in the first place, felt a pang of guilt. Was the woman lost? In trouble? Had she run off because she was afraid or hiding something? Trying to shake the unease, Melissa turned back onto the winding road toward her apartment. The rain had picked up, making visibility almost non-existent. The rhythmic thump of the windshield wipers provided a strange comfort as she drove. though she couldn't shake the image of the woman's face from her mind. Her hollow cheeks, the strange smile, the way her eyes seemed to linger too long when they met Melissa's. By the time Melissa arrived home, her nerves were frayed. She lived in a modest duplex in a quiet neighborhood. The street was nearly empty at this late hour, and the only light came from her neighbor's upstairs apartment. She hurried from her car to her front door, fumbled with her keys, and finally slipped inside. The warmth of her apartment wrapped around her, calming her slightly. Setting her things down on the kitchen counter, she poured herself a glass of water and tried to focus on mundane tasks, anything to distract her from the strange encounter. Still, she couldn't shake the sense of being watched. She glanced out her living room window into the dark street below. Nothing. After taking a melatonin, Melissa climbed into bed, hoping sleep would erase the lingering unease. But as the hours ticked by, she found herself unable to drift off. Every creak of the apartment, every gust of wind outside, made her heart jump. And then she heard it, a faint sound from the living room. At first, she told herself it was the upstairs tenant. The old house was known for amplifying even the smallest noises. But then it came again, a distinct shuffle, like someone moving cautiously. Her heart began to race. She lay frozen under the blankets, holding her breath, straining to listen. The sound stopped, and for a moment she thought she'd imagined it. But as her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she realized something was wrong. Her bedroom door, which she always closed at night, was ajar. Melissa's stomach churned. And then, from the corner of her room, she saw it. A shadow, crouched low, unmoving. It was barely visible in the darkness, but unmistakably there. Her breath caught in her throat as she blinked rapidly, hoping it was a trick of the light. The shadow didn't waver. It stayed there, hunched and ominous like a predator waiting to pounce. Melissa's mind screamed at her to move, to scream, to do something, but her body refused to cooperate. And then, slowly, the shadow rose. It unfurled like a grotesque figure from a nightmare, standing tall and unnervingly still. It didn't lunge, didn't make a sound. Instead, it walked out of her room, disappearing into the hallway. Melissa sat in stunned silence, unable to process what had just happened. No footsteps, no doors opening or closing, just silence. Melissa sat frozen in her bed, her breath shallow and uneven. Her pulse thundered in her ears as the darkness around her seemed to close in. She reached for her phone on the nightstand with trembling fingers and quickly dialed her father's number. It rang twice before his groggy voice answered. "Melissa? What's wrong?" I think someone's in my apartment," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I woke up, and someone was in my room." Her father hesitated, likely trying to process what he'd just heard. "Are you sure? Could it have been a dream? A night terror?" Melissa wanted to believe him. Maybe it was just her imagination, fueled by exhaustion and the eerie events of the night. But she couldn't shake the vivid image of the shadow standing in the corner of her room, the slow, deliberate way it had moved. "I don't know," she replied, her voice barely audible. It felt real. Her father urged her to check the apartment and assured her he'd stay on the line. Summoning every ounce of courage, Melissa crept out of bed, clutching her phone tightly. She switched on the light in her bedroom, then peeked cautiously into the hallway. The apartment was silent, the dim glow of the streetlights outside barely filtering through the blinds. She checked the living room, the kitchen, the tiny bathroom. Nothing. "Everything looks fine," she said, though her voice still trembled. Her father offered reassuring words, but the unease remained. After hanging up, Melissa double-checked the locks on her doors and windows and retreated back to her bedroom. This time she locked the door behind her. The night dragged on in tense silence until exhaustion finally overtook her. She drifted into an uneasy sleep, plagued by fragmented dreams of dark figures lurking just out of sight. When morning arrived, The first rays of sunlight filtering through her curtains brought a sense of relief. Melissa got out of bed, groggy but determined to shake off the events of the night. She brewed a cup of coffee and prepared for her usual gym routine. After dressing, she grabbed her bag and headed toward the door. As she reached for the doorknob, a strange sensation of dread washed over her. The lock was already undone. She froze, her mind racing. Hadn't she locked it? She was certain she had. Her pulse quickened as she opened the door and stepped into the small foyer connecting her apartment to the outside. Nothing seemed out of place, but the uneasy feeling lingered. She walked to her car, the damp morning air chilling her skin. Opening the back door to toss her gym bag inside, Melissa froze. The sight before her turned her blood cold. The backseat floor was covered in damp, muddy stains, smeared as though someone had been sitting there in wet clothes. Her blanket, which she always kept folded neatly on the seat, was gone. Her mind reeled. It didn't make sense. The car had been locked, or at least she thought it had been. And then the realization hit her like a thunderclap. The woman from last night. When Melissa had gone into the gas station, the woman must have climbed into the back seat. She'd been there the entire ride home. Her chest tightened as a wave of nausea swept over her. Had the woman followed her inside? Had she been the shadow in the corner of the room? Melissa felt her knees weaken as she stumbled backward from the car, her breaths coming in sharp, shallow gasps. She immediately called her father, recounting everything in a frantic voice. He listened carefully and then offered a grim conclusion. "If nothing's missing and you're okay, there's not much the police can do," he said. "Just be more careful. Make sure everything's locked next time." Melissa hung up, her mind racing. Her apartment had been untouched, but the unsettling truth was clear. Someone had been in her home. Someone had watched her while she slept. She couldn't stay there another night. The sense of safety she'd once felt in her little apartment was gone, replaced by an overwhelming dread. By the end of the month, Melissa had packed her belongings and moved to a new place, leaving behind the haunting memory of that rainy night. But even now, whenever the rain falls and shadows flicker in the corners of her vision, Melissa can't help but wonder, where did that woman go? And would she ever cross her path again? Stranded after the party. The night air was sharp and cold, cutting through the thin hoodie Ryan wore as he trudged down a dimly lit street in Spokane, Washington. The party had been a blur, a mix of loud music, too many drinks, and faces he barely recognized. What he did remember was the sting of betrayal when he realized his best friend, Jake, had left without him. Jake had convinced him to leave his phone in the car to keep it safe. Now stranded in the chilly darkness, Ryan cursed himself for going along with such a reckless idea. The streets were nearly deserted, with only the occasional car passing by, its headlights streaking through the night. His house wasn't far, but the distance felt insurmountable in his drunken haze. The pavement beneath his sneakers seemed to stretch endlessly, and the bitter wind gnawed at his exposed skin. He wrapped his arms tightly around himself, his breath visible in the cold, trying to focus on putting one foot in front of the other. As he stumbled down the road, he couldn't ignore the uneasy silence. The distant hum of a street lamp buzzed faintly, and the occasional rustle of leaves sent shivers down his spine. It wasn't just the cold making him uncomfortable, it was the growing sense that he wasn't entirely alone. The shadows seemed to shift when he wasn't looking, stretching unnaturally across the cracked pavement. After what felt like an eternity, Ryan decided he couldn't go much farther on foot. His legs were heavy, his head spinning. The idea of hitchhiking, A thought he would have scoffed at in a sober moment now seemed like his best option. He stuck out his thumb at the next approaching vehicle, hoping someone would take pity on him. Several cars passed without slowing, their drivers probably reluctant to pick up a stranger so late at night. Finally, a pair of headlights slowed. The vehicle was an old gray pickup truck, its paint chipped and dulled by time. The truck rolled to a stop just ahead of him, and Ryan hesitated for a brief moment before approaching. The driver rolled down the window, a man in his 60s with a bushy beard and tired eyes. He gave Ryan a small nod and asked, "Need a ride, son?" Relief washed over Ryan as he climbed into the passenger seat. "Yeah, thanks. Just heading down to West Central," he said, his voice shaky from the cold. The man nodded and put the truck into gear, pulling back onto the road. The warmth of the heater was a welcome reprieve, but something about the man's silence unsettled Ryan. He tried to focus on the passing streetlights and the blur of houses outside. The driver's hands gripped the wheel tightly, his knuckles pale under the faint glow of the dashboard lights. Every now and then, the man would glance at Ryan, not in a friendly or curious way, but with an intensity that made his skin crawl. Ryan shifted in his seat, suddenly hyper-aware of how vulnerable he was. The man's next words confirmed his worst fears. "You know," he said, his voice low and deliberate, "hitchhiking at night's a dangerous game. You never know what kind of person might pick you up." Ryan's stomach dropped. The man's words hung in the air like an ominous cloud, each syllable sending chills racing down Ryan's spine. He forced a nervous laugh, hoping to diffuse the tension. "Yeah, guess I got lucky tonight," he muttered, though the words felt hollow as they left his mouth. The driver didn't respond, his focus shifting back to the road, but the smirk that curled at the corners of his mouth told Ryan everything he needed to know. He hadn't gotten lucky at all. The truck rumbled along the empty streets, but something wasn't right. Ryan recognized these roads. They should have already passed his turn by now. His pulse quickened as he glanced at the landmarks slipping by, none of which looked familiar. His house was supposed to be close, too close for this kind of detour. "Hey," Ryan said, trying to keep his voice steady, "I think you missed the turn. My place is back that way." The man didn't answer at first. Instead, he gripped the wheel tighter, his knuckles gleaming white under the dim dashboard light. Then, in that same low, almost taunting tone, he said, "Don't worry, son. I know a shortcut." Ryan's chest tightened. Panic clawed at the edges of his mind, but he forced himself to stay calm. Maybe it really was a shortcut. Maybe the man just didn't understand how freaked out he sounded. But deep down, Ryan knew better. The man's tone, his sideways glances, the way his fingers clenched the wheel like a predator closing in on prey. It all screamed danger. The truck veered off the main road, the tires crunching onto a narrow, unlit gravel path. Ryan's heart raced as the dense forest loomed around them, the trees forming an oppressive tunnel of shadows. The glow of the truck's headlights barely cut through the darkness, illuminating only the jagged outlines of branches and the gravel stretching endlessly ahead. "I don't think this is the right way," Ryan said, his voice cracking despite his best effort to sound firm. "I can just walk the rest of the way. You can drop me off here." The man let out a low chuckle that froze Ryan in place. "Now, why would I do that? You're already here. Might as well enjoy the ride." The words hit Ryan like a punch to the gut. His instincts screamed at him to run, but the truck was still moving, its doors locked. He gripped the door handle anyway, fumbling for the lock. The man noticed and shot him a sharp glance. "Don't even think about it," he hissed, his smirk vanishing as his face twisted into something far more menacing. Ryan froze, his breath caught in his throat. The man's change in demeanor was terrifying, a predator revealing its fangs. The silence in the cab was suffocating now, broken only by the crunch of gravel under the tires and the faint hum of the engine. Ryan's mind raced. If he didn't act soon, he might not get another chance. The trees outside seemed to close in, their shadows shifting like silent witnesses to his impending doom. His fingers trembled as he quietly reached for the door handle again, this time waiting for the truck to slow just enough. Suddenly, the man spoke again, his voice a low growl. "You ever hear about people who disappear on nights like this? No one ever finds them. It's like the forest just swallows them whole." Ryan couldn't suppress a shiver. The man's words weren't just a story. They felt like a promise. And as the truck crawled to a near stop, Ryan knew he had to make a move. The truck slowed to a crawl, its headlights casting long, jagged beams across the suffocating darkness of the forest. Ryan's heart thundered in his chest as he tightened his grip on the door handle. The man's words lingered in the air, each one cutting deeper into Ryan's growing panic. The truck came to a stop. For a moment, the only sound was the steady hum of the engine and the distant rustling of leaves in the cold night breeze. The man turned toward Ryan. His face illuminated by the eerie green glow of the dashboard lights. His smirk had twisted into something far darker, predatory and cruel. "This is where the ride ends," the man said, his voice low and brimming with malice. Ryan's instincts screamed at him to run. Without thinking, he yanked the door handle, his breath catching as it clicked open. Cold air rushed into the cab as he shoved the door wide and tumbled out onto the gravel road. His knees scraped against the rough surface, but the pain barely registered over the adrenaline coursing through him. "Get back here," the man roared, slamming his door shut and stomping around the front of the truck. Ryan didn't wait to see what would happen next. He scrambled to his feet and bolted into the woods, branches clawing at his face and arms as he plunged into the darkness. The uneven ground threatened to trip him, but he kept running, fueled by sheer terror. Behind him, he heard the man crashing through the underbrush, his heavy footsteps growing louder with each second. Ryan's breath came in sharp gasps, his chest burning, but he didn't dare slow down. The forest seemed endless, its dense canopy swallowing all traces of moonlight. He dodged between trees, his sneakers slipping on wet leaves, his pulse pounding in his ears. The man's voice bellowed somewhere behind him, filled with fury. "You can't run forever," the man shouted. "You won't make it out of here alive." Ryan's lungs screamed for air, and his legs felt like lead, but he pushed forward. In the distance, through the thick maze of trees, he saw a faint light. A pair of headlights cutting through the night. Hope surged in his chest as he angled toward the glow, his last reserves of strength driving him forward. Breaking through the tree line, Ryan stumbled onto the edge of another road, his legs nearly giving out beneath him. A car was approaching, its headlights growing brighter as it neared. He waved his arms frantically, yelling for help, his voice hoarse and desperate. The car screeched to a halt, and the driver, a middle-aged man, jumped out, his face etched with concern. "What's going on? Are you okay?" the man asked, rushing toward Ryan. Before Ryan could respond, the sound of heavy footsteps emerged from the woods. The man from the truck appeared, his face twisted with anger. For a moment, all three stood frozen, the tension crackling like electricity in the air. The driver of the car stepped forward, putting himself between Ryan and the man. "Is there a problem here?" he asked firmly, his voice laced with warning. The truck driver hesitated, his gaze darting between Ryan and the newcomer. Then, without a word, he turned and stormed back into the woods, disappearing into the shadows. The driver of the car watched him go, his expression a mix of confusion and unease. "Come on, kid," he said, motioning to Ryan. "Let's get you out of here." Ryan climbed into the back seat, his body trembling as relief washed over him. As the car pulled away, he glanced back at the dark forest, half expecting the man to reappear. But the trees remained still, their jagged silhouettes fading into the distance. That night, as he finally stumbled through the front door of his house, Ryan swore he'd never hitchhike again. But even now, when he's alone in the dark, he can still hear the man's voice echoing in his mind. You won't make it out of here alive. The passports of the dead. It was late October when Daniel, a 29-year-old painter from Chicago, found himself stranded outside of Denver, Colorado. He'd been hitchhiking back from a small gallery show in Boulder, carrying only a duffel bag of his belongings and a folder of sketches he couldn't afford to lose. The chill of autumn settled into his bones as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the two-lane road cutting through the Colorado countryside. The road was eerily quiet, with only the occasional car passing by. The surrounding fields and distant mountains were swallowed by darkness, leaving Daniel with the uneasy sensation of being the only living soul for miles. He stuck out his thumb as headlights approached in the distance, praying someone would stop before the cold became unbearable. After what felt like an eternity, a battered green station wagon pulled up. The car's paint was chipped, and the headlights flickered faintly, but Daniel didn't care. He jogged toward the passenger side as the window rolled down. Behind the wheel sat a man in his early 30s, unshaven and wearing a threadbare flannel shirt. His smile was wide but didn't quite reach his eyes. "Need a lift?" the man asked in a hoarse voice, his thick Midwestern accent immediately noticeable. Daniel hesitated for just a moment before nodding. "Yeah, thanks. Just trying to get to Denver." The man gestured to the passenger seat, and Daniel climbed in, the warmth of the heater immediately enveloping him. The interior of the car smelled faintly of old leather and motor oil. Daniel tried to relax as the car pulled back onto the road, but something about the man's demeanor made it difficult. His smile lingered too long, and his movements seemed unnervingly deliberate, like he was carefully considering every turn of the wheel or glance in the rearview mirror. "What's your name?" the man asked, breaking the silence. "Daniel," he replied, gripping the strap of his bag tightly. "And you?" "Roger," the man said with a grin that felt too wide for his face. "So, what brings you out here on foot?" Daniel explained his trip, mentioning the art show in Boulder and his need to get back to Denver. Roger listened intently, nodding in exaggerated agreement, though his expression never quite matched the casual conversation. His hands gripped the wheel a little too tightly, and every few seconds, his eyes darted toward Daniel with unnerving interest. After several minutes of tense silence, Roger reached into the glove compartment without warning. Daniel stiffened, half expecting a weapon, but instead Roger pulled out a small stack of worn passports. "Check these out," Roger said, his voice tinged with amusement as he handed them to Daniel. Confused, Daniel flipped through them. The first bore the smiling face of a young woman named Anna, her dark hair neatly tied back. The second belonged to another woman, blonde and carefree, named Rebecca. The third and fourth were just as unsettling. Different women, all young, all beautiful, and all with faces that seemed to radiate life. "Unlucky girls," Roger said, his tone strangely casual. "Anna died in a car wreck. Rebecca, horse accident. Each one of them met a bad end." Daniel's throat tightened as he stared at the passports in his hands. The dates of issue were recent, but the photos seemed almost out of place, like they were frozen moments of lives cut short. He forced himself to hand the passports back, his hands trembling slightly. "You collect these?" Daniel asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Roger chuckled, a sound that made Daniel's skin crawl. "Something like that." The smile on Roger's face grew wider, and Daniel felt the first pangs of real fear. The road ahead had grown narrower, and the forest loomed on either side. The last traces of civilization were behind them now, and the world seemed to close in as the trees swallowed the faint glow of the moon. The narrow road plunged into dense forest, the tall pines leaning inward as if conspiring to hide the horrors within. Daniel's unease grew with every mile as the headlights barely pierced the surrounding darkness. The silence between him and Roger stretched long, punctuated only by the rumble of the station wagon's engine and the occasional crunch of fallen branches beneath the tires. Roger's demeanor shifted subtly as the miles wore on. He no longer made attempts at small talk, his hands tightening on the steering wheel as his eyes flickered toward Daniel with unnerving frequency. Daniel tried to steady his breathing, keeping his focus on the road ahead, though his mind raced with worst-case scenarios. He replayed the moment Roger pulled out the passports, the strange, almost gleeful way he described each woman's tragic death. "Where exactly are we headed?" Daniel finally asked, forcing his voice to remain calm despite the rising dread in his chest. Roger didn't answer right away. Instead, he smirked and muttered, "Shortcut." Daniel's stomach sank. There was no reason to take a shortcut. Denver was straightforward from the main road. The trees outside seemed to press closer, the darkness growing thicker. He could no longer see the stars through the canopy, and the isolation was suffocating. "I really appreciate the ride," Daniel said carefully, his voice carrying a note of forced gratitude. "But I'm okay getting out here. I can walk the rest of the way." Roger's laugh was low and guttural, devoid of humor. "Walk? Out here? In this cold? You wouldn't make it a mile." Daniel's hand inched toward the door handle, his pulse quickening. He pressed the button to unlock the door, but nothing happened. Roger glanced at him and smirked. "Child locks. Don't want you falling out," he said, his tone dripping with mock concern. The station wagon began to slow as the road narrowed further, its wheels crunching against gravel. Daniel's heart pounded as the trees gave way to a small clearing. The headlights illuminated a rundown cabin with boarded-up windows, its exterior weathered and blackened as though scorched by fire. Roger killed the engine, and the sudden silence felt deafening. He turned toward Daniel, his smile twisted into something predatory. "We're here," he said, his voice eerily calm. Daniel's throat tightened as he gripped the strap of his bag. "What is this place?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Roger leaned back in his seat, his eyes gleaming with something unspoken. "Just a little stop along the way. You look like the kind of guy who appreciates interesting places." Every instinct in Daniel's body screamed at him to get out of the car, but the locked door felt like a steel trap. He glanced at the keys still in the ignition, and then at Roger, who was now watching him with an almost hypnotic intensity. "Why don't you come inside for a bit?" Roger said, gesturing toward the cabin. "Stretch your legs, maybe I'll show you more of my collection." Daniel's blood ran cold. "No thanks," he said, his voice trembling. "I really need to get going." Roger's smile faltered, his eyes narrowing. The tension in the car became unbearable, like the air itself had thickened. Without breaking eye contact, Roger reached into his jacket, his movements deliberate and slow. Daniel didn't wait to see what Roger was reaching for. With a sudden burst of adrenaline, he lunged for the keys, twisting them hard in the ignition. The engine roared to life as Roger shouted in surprise, lunging toward him. Daniel threw his weight against the door, shoving it into Roger's side just enough to disorient him. The car lurched forward, its tires spitting gravel as Daniel wrestled the wheel, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Roger's furious yells faded into the distance as the headlights sliced through the forest once more. But the road ahead was a labyrinth of darkness, and Daniel's nightmare was far from over. The station wagon barreled down the dark forest road, its headlights bouncing wildly as Daniel gripped the wheel with trembling hands. His chest heaved with panicked breaths, his mind racing faster than the car itself. He couldn't stop replaying the look in Roger's eyes, a blend of cold calculation and twisted delight. The rearview mirror reflected nothing but pitch black. Daniel wanted to believe he had escaped, but the oppressive silence of the forest felt alive, as if Roger's presence still lingered, unseen but unrelenting. Every shadow between the trees seemed to stretch toward the road, clawing at the edges of the headlights. The winding gravel path felt endless, each turn blending into the next. His grip tightened on the wheel as his pulse thundered in his ears. He didn't know where the road led. All he could do was keep driving, praying it would take him back to the main highway. And then he saw it. Far ahead, illuminated faintly by the car's high beams, a figure stood in the middle of the road. The silhouette was unmistakable: Roger. His arms were spread wide, his face partially obscured by the shadows, but the twisted grin Daniel had grown to fear shone through the darkness. Daniel slammed on the brakes, the tires skidding against the gravel as the car lurched to a stop just feet from where Roger stood. For a moment, neither of them moved. Daniel's breath caught in his throat as Roger took a single step closer, his hand reaching for the door handle. "No," Daniel whispered, his voice trembling. "No, no, no." He threw the car into reverse, the engine roaring as he sped backward. Roger didn't chase him. He didn't have to. His figure remained hauntingly still, his head cocked slightly to the side as if he were savoring the fear that radiated from Daniel. The car fishtailed on the loose gravel as Daniel reversed around a bend. He hit the brakes again, the wheels screeching to a halt, and threw the car into drive. But the road had betrayed him. It now split into two paths, both leading deeper into the forest. "Damn it," Daniel shouted, slamming his fists against the steering wheel. He glanced over his shoulder, expecting Roger to appear behind him at any second, but the road was empty. The oppressive silence of the forest pressed down on him, suffocating in its weight. He chose the left path, accelerating blindly into the dark. The trees seemed to close in tighter, their branches forming grotesque shapes that loomed overhead. Just when he thought the nightmare couldn't get worse, the car jolted violently, its tires sinking into soft mud. The engine groaned as the wheels spun uselessly, kicking up wet dirt. "Come on," Daniel muttered desperately. Slamming the gas pedal, the car refused to budge. He threw open the door and stumbled out, his shoes sinking into the cold, wet ground. The only light came from the car's headlights, casting long, eerie shadows that danced with every movement. And then he heard it, a slow, deliberate crunch of footsteps on the gravel behind him. Daniel spun around, his heart pounding so loudly he could barely hear his own panicked breaths. Roger emerged from the shadows, his expression calm and unnervingly smug. He held something in his hand, something glinting faintly in the dim light. "You didn't think you'd get away, did you?" Roger asked, his voice low and almost conversational. "You're part of the collection now." Daniel's instincts kicked in. He turned and bolted into the forest, the branches tearing at his clothes as he ran blindly through the darkness. His breath came in ragged gasps, and every muscle in his body burned, but he didn't stop. Roger's footsteps followed, steady and unhurried, as if he knew there was no escape. After what felt like an eternity, Daniel burst through the tree line onto an empty stretch of highway. A pair of headlights approached in the distance, and he stumbled into the middle of the road, waving his arms frantically. The car screeched to a halt, and a woman rolled down the window, her face filled with concern. "Are you okay?" "What happened?" she asked. "Please," Daniel gasped. "He's coming. You have to get me out of here." Without hesitation, the woman unlocked the door, and Daniel climbed into the passenger seat. He barely managed to choke out a thank you before she sped off, leaving the forest and Roger behind. But as the highway stretched out before him, Daniel's relief was short-lived. In the back seat of the woman's car, nestled between a pile of belongings, was a familiar sight. A stack of worn passports.